Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to week 2 of the Riverside University Design Challenge. I'm Tab, or more formally Tabitha Binding, your programme manager. I work for TRADA and the Timber Trade Federation and deliver the University Engagement Programme. A few slides just to explain about TRADA. We have free student access. Just register. Don't register here, as you'll only come in as register user. Head to the academic page, scroll down, register in the big orange box, and if you're a lecturer, you also get to register and sign up for free. We've got 63 units, 8 modules, an infinite number of whiz sheets, which are wood information sheets, and 100+ case studies. And especially opened to you students for this competition, we have books online. We have timber frame construction, and Robin Lancashire will come and talk to us next week. We have offsite and industrialised timber construction, and Professor Robert Hairstands spoke to us last week. We have cross-laminated timber. We have structural timber elements, and we have designing timber structures, which is a completely new book out. And James Norman will come to talk to us in week 4. So this is week 2, sustainable construction, and 3 evenings this week, we will have some fabulous speakers talking about the schemes that they have delivered. And here are tonight's speakers. And with that, I would like to hand over to Andy von Bradsky, who is our chair for this evening, who is head of architecture of MHCLG.
Very good evening. Can you hear me okay? Hope so. Good show. Well, a very good evening to you all. I was asked to do this a very short time ago, so I'm dropping into a programme that looks fascinating to me, and I really look forward to hearing all about it and about the work that it's doing and about the projects that we're going to hear this evening. A good evening for learning and inspiration for all of us, I think. Well done to all of you for participating and joining in an evening of engagement. Really good stuff. Now, just to elaborate a little bit on who I am and what I do, my name's Express, but I work in the government, in the Ministry of Housing, Communities, Local Government. I advise on all asset design. I primarily have been sitting in the Planning Directorate, and I'll mention some of the documents that you might want to refer to as a sort of learning module of its own type. But some really good stuff going on there in government at the moment on this particular theme. My business life was as a chairman, and previous to that a director of a very large architectural practice for which I was employed for 30 years, and I retired 5 years ago from that particular practice to join government and to work from, I guess, policy to practice. So some real shift in my life as a qualified practitioner. This event, I guess, is all about interdisciplinary working, so I won't emphasize the architectural aspects too much. You'll hear a lot about that, no doubt, but this is all about how lots of disciplines might come together to deliver the objectives and the ambition that Sunderland have set for this particular programme. So I'm hoping there's a rich mix of different disciplines who are all expecting to work together on this particular challenge. Design nowadays is a very complicated business. It's not something that just happens because somebody has a single idea. It's very much about iteration, interaction, and working very closely together. So this particular challenge, clearly about a carbon neutral urban quarter, really interested in that. The 100 units and one particular home being developed to great detail. Reflects a competition that we set within government called Home 2030, and you'll hear a lot more about that from Home Plus group later this evening. But really, we wanted to do much the same as the challenge being set to you, which was about how do we create the home of the future. That is something that's flexible, adaptable, healthy, carbon responsive, pointed towards zero carbon ambition for the future, and using modern methods of construction to improve productivity. Those are all the challenges that I guess you're going to be faced with in the projects that you're going to be working together on to submit for this competition. Government, just going back to government, really concerned at the moment about quality, and that's arisen from a lot of particular issues, which sees the stars aligning around quality as a general theme. One of the reasons I'm there, I guess. And you know, the Grenfell disaster alone was something that has spawned a real commitment to improve the technology and the safety of buildings. Productivity, how do we produce our homes? How do we improve the way in which we deliver new homes in the future? The carbon challenge, you know, probably the most significant thing that we are going to be facing in the future. What is life like post-COVID? What are the challenges for designers in addressing the really changing work patterns of everybody? How do we design our public environment to be much more people-oriented, nature-oriented? How do we get walking and cycling much more mainstream? All those issues are things that we're thinking about in government at the moment. And the one thing I'd point you to is work that I've been doing on the National Model Design Code, take note, and the National Design Guide, and some guidance notes. And I recommend that for reading, extracurricular, if you like. It contains as much information as you're likely to gather from government, probably for the last 10 years since the Urban Design Compendium was published, which is another good read. Anyway, so enough from me. I'm going to sort of sit back and listen and manage some of the questions that are going to come forward. And I'm delighted that we're going to hear about Goldsmith Street again, because we've heard a lot about it and you can't get enough of it. It really is a cracking scheme. I was on the judging panel when it had a Housing Design Awards and won the Sterling Prize that year. So well done to the client, well done to the architects, well done to all the consultants involved. On that note, I'll hand over to Andrew Turnbull.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. So, yes, tonight you've got myself, James Senna, who is the Associate Director for Mikhail Richards Architects, Harriet Bourne, who's the Director of BBUK Landscape Architects on the scheme, and Sally Godber, who's the Director of Warm, who are our Passive House consultants. I'm the Interim Housing Development Manager at Norwich City Council. Been an interim now for, well, it's getting on for 1.5 years, so it's about time it was made permanent. But just starting off with how we've sort of got to where we are and how we kicked off with Goldsmith Street. So the challenges that we have as a council are, obviously we've got a housing crisis, we've got housing needs in Norwich for at least 240 social rented homes each year. As a council, we hadn't built for over 20 years. I think 1992 was the previous scheme that we built. And primarily that was down to right to buy that kind of prevented us from using our money to build. We had a number of other challenges around our finances with cuts in government grant, threats of high value voids that we would have to pay subsidy for our high value properties, a 4-year rent reduction that took, I think, 30 million out of our 4-year plan and 250 million out of our 30-year plan. Increased right to buy through it, the discounts being reinvigorated, and we've had issues with up and down on Public Works Loan Board borrowing rates. All of that sort of sets a scenario where it was quite brave of the council to take a decision to start building again and to start building really high quality as well, and not just go for numbers. This is a picture of my leader and deputy leader of the council out on site at the start of Goldsmith Street. And they've got real ambitions around meeting housing need. They're wedded to social rents and not affordable rents because they feel that social rents is what is affordable to our tenants. They've got real commitments to reducing fuel poverty. But more than just building homes, it's about creating communities. And I think what you will see with Goldsmith Street, that was at the heart of the ethos of the entire team. It wasn't just about building houses, it's about creating that community and integrating it into the wider community. And more recently, since we've finished Goldsmith Street and it has received the accolades, it's about how can we promote more councils building and show them that if we can do it, so can you. And so we've been doing numerous conferences with Mikhail, Richards and others to kind of promote what we've done and to really pass on our learning from Goldsmith Street. So why did we choose to go down the route of Passive House? As I said earlier, reducing fuel poverty was a real key driver. Around 13% of the residents of Norwich are in fuel poverty. And so it's been recognised that we need to start to address that. On top of that, we've got the climate crisis, and we have made a commitment to reducing our carbon across the City Council. And we can see that the built environment plays a key part in that. For me, as the housing manager or housing development officer I was at the time, Passive House for me was really about quality control. I was concerned that things like Code for Sustainable Home, BREEAM, other sort of standards, they kind of showed what you could do at design stage, but there was a bit of a performance gap when it came to actually how they were built. With Passive House, you don't get that. You've got that real sort of commitment to quality control, and it's tested throughout the process. In the council, we've got a number of policies that kind of support us going down that route. So we've got an environmental strategy that says that we'll deliver to Passive House or at least Code for Sustainable Homes Level 4. We've got planning policy that we've managed to change that says we've got a commitment for 10% renewables, but if we do Passive House, then we don't also need to do the bolt-on add-ons like PVs, air source heat pumps. Obviously helps with reducing our carbon footprint, but also we noticed that in Norfolk, there was already a number of contractors that had done small levels of Passive House or higher levels of code. And so we felt that we could offer opportunities for those local contractors to build on that knowledge and that experience and give them sort of a pipeline of sites that they can kind of then use that to sell to others. So Goldsmith Street's actually our third Passive House scheme. The scheme on the left-hand side is our first one. It was 10 units, 2 blocks of flats, Hansard Close. And we learned some lessons on there around what we needed to tell our tenants. So if I tell you that you learn the hard way, and the first thing that one of our tenants did was drilled holes into the window frames to put blinds up. It's not exactly ideal for what we want to do with Passive House. So we learned that we needed to tell our tenants a bit more upfront about Passive House. And also with the mechanical vent heat recovery system, we realized that we probably needed to do more than 1 filter change a year. So we've now committed to doing at least 2 and advising residents about how they clean those themselves. And the scheme on the right is actually being taken forward by our wholly owned company that delivers private houses for sale and rent. And that's 3 score in Bowthorpe. We've got 153 units on that phase, and 112 of them have been designed to achieve Passive House. We were initially seeing a 5% premium on the sales for Passive House units. I think with the past year and COVID, that's kind of equalised out and people aren't necessarily prepared to pay that. But we would hope that through lobbying of RICS, then they can start to recognise that there is a premium that could be attached to those. So just moving on to Goldsmith Street then, a little bit of context. Victorian times, this is our historic map from 1938. You can see that there's a series of terraced houses. There's a timber yard in the middle, but there was about 80 terraced houses on the site. They were knocked down in sort of post-war clearance. And in the 1960s, you have the sort of scheme that's on the right-hand side, which was a big old county council care home in the middle, and 25 very small sheltered housing bungalows. So you can see that the density really went down quite considerably on the site. And we felt that that was a bit of a waste of space within the city. So having looked at that and having talked to the county council about buying that care home, we felt that we could actually form a better site and sort of really up the density in this area. Oops. So the decision to take and to decommission the sheltered bungalows, which you can see in the picture, was taken in 2007. We were then working with 3 registered providers rather than delivering ourselves. And we persuaded them. There was a couple of really sort of forward-thinking people in the council. One, Jamie Radcliffe, who's now an executive director at Network Homes, and our design and conservation manager, Ben Webster, who's still with us. We managed to persuade those registered providers to go down the route of a REBA competition to select the architects. So we ran that competition in 2009. The 3 RPs, for various reasons, then kind of dropped out over a period of 3 to 4 years. And what happened in the meantime in 2012 is that the government announced that they would relook at the housing revenue account and allow local authorities to keep all of the rents that they received from their tenants. Prior to this, Norwich had to pay £9 million a year over to subsidy to support the kind of national housing revenue account. So by keeping all those rents in return for taking on a proportion of that national debt, it meant that we had about £30 million worth of headroom. And number one priority for our members and for our tenants was to build more social housing. So 2014, once we got our heads around the amount of money that we had and what we wanted to do with it, we re-engaged Mikhail Richards because we were party to that original competition. We were able to just pick up the phone to them and start again. And I think I did worry David Mikhail, I don't think James was in the room at the time, by saying, oh, we've had a look at it and that design that you've done, we really like it, but could you just make it passive house as if it was the easiest thing in the world? So once we've kind of got that on board, 2016, we achieved planning permission, and 2018, January, we started on site. It was about an 18-month build period. So we completed the first phase, and I'll come on to that in the next slides, in June 2019. So the REBA competition, just briefly on that, we had over 100 submissions. We set out a brief for that competition that we wanted approximately 100 homes on the site, but we also wanted a real mix of houses and flats. We didn't just want flats. We wanted a high quality design, we wanted reduced parking, it's only a 10-minute walk to the city centre, and we wanted to create routes that weren't there for both green links, pedestrian and cycleways. There's a kind of a small pocket park to the south of the site that I'm sure Harriet will kind of touch on, and we wanted to link that green space through the site and into wider sort of infrastructure. I just pull this one quote out of the design brief that was hidden right at the back, which was that we wanted to become an exemplar of good social housing with the potential to win architectural awards. And I think you can quite clearly see that we managed to achieve that. The plan shows those sort of linkages that we were trying to create through the vision statement that we set out. And speaking to David Mikhail, he says that it was that sort of commitment to quality and that ethos within that design brief that really attracted them to the competition. So in terms of what we've delivered, we had planning permission for 105 homes. We've actually delivered 93. There were some rights-of-way issues with a local business that we had to resolve. So we've decided to do the 12 units that affected as a second phase. We are still very committed to that. We've just got to resolve those issues before we take it forward. But because within the sort of project management triangle of cost, quality and time, quality was the number one priority for the council, we decided to go down the route of a JCT standard traditional contract rather than a design and build. And I think that's really kept that ethos of that original scheme that was designed back in 2009 and actually enhanced it by giving the architects the control over materials, over decisions around design throughout the process, and that not being watered down through a design and build process. So in terms of costs, construction's around 1875, that's crept up a little bit now to I think up to about 1900 a square metre, and total project cost is around 2,200 a square metre. I think that that's fantastic value for money in terms of what we've achieved. So this is lovely. This is us up on stage achieving the Sterling Prize and the list of awards that we've managed to achieve for the scheme. But I think for me and for my members, this is what it's actually about. And this is just some anecdotal quotes from our tenants about what it means living in Goldsmith Street. And I think the number one there was somebody who we'd spoken to after living in the property for 5 months, and she still hadn't had to put her heating on once. That shows to me that we made that right decision about Passive House and it doing what it says on the tin. This is just a quote from my deputy leader, Gail. We held an open day for the scheme once it was all completed, kindly supported by Mikhail Richards. And we invited all of the tenants to kind of meet each other to foster that sense of community. And I think what Gail says, it's the fabric of the building is wonderful, but it's about families making these homes their own and forming new community in that area. That's what's really important for her. I think that's me done. I'm going to now pass over to James, who will take you through more of the detail of the scheme.
Thanks, Andrew. Evening, everyone. As I was introduced, I was the associate in charge of Goldsmith Street. So I worked on the project for around 5 years. So, you know, a good portion of my professional career has been spent on this project, and obviously it's done very well. So it's been a kind of real privilege to be part of. I think you're going to be spoken to by Sally and Harriet shortly, who represent the kind of landscape and passive house side of the scheme. But obviously there was a much wider design team that contributed to this project. And I think it's worth just kind of noting that, you know, there's a huge team of people, including the client, that kind of a party to this project. Just a bit of kind of context from Mikhail Richards' point of view. Goldsmith Street came after another project, which was a kind of real pivotal project for the practice. It's a project called Clay Fields. If you want more information, you can find it on our website. I won't focus on that this evening, but I think the real key lesson that the practice took from this project was that a huge amount of post-occupancy evaluation work was done. And actually the thing that really kind of shone through as being something that worked on this project was the solar strategy. And when the competition for Goldsmith Street came along, that's something that David Nannerly kind of very quickly wove into the master plan and embedded from day one. And that's something I would say that kind of in our work moving forward now as a practice, we're finding that to get good zero carbon schemes to come forward, the master plan is essential. And I know as part of the work that the brief that Tabitha's put together is that, you know, there is a real focus on zero carbon. And I think understanding simple things like the sun orientation is absolutely key. And if you get that wrong from the start, you'll be fighting against it all the way through. So there's a kind of little opening tip. Just in terms of Goldsmith Street, obviously Andrew's already said, and Andy, you know, we've won a number of awards. It has been put on a bit of a pedestal. It's slightly bashful sometimes when people say lovely things about it. But I think what's really important is that we share that learning. And I think the real kind of key takeaways are this idea of a low energy passive solar design. So embedding kind of a solar strategy into the master plan. Passive house we use very much as a shorthand. I think Andrew and Andy's point about kind of quality is key. And I think passive house gives you a route to getting to zero carbon by embedding it in the fabric of the building. And I think that's just a very kind of, again, very simple takeaway from this talk. My introduction to Tabitha was actually a conference where I was speaking where she didn't realize this was a timber construction. And I think maybe a lot of people don't realize that behind this brick facade, there's actually a timber frame that's insulated with warm cell. We work with a company called Signum Timber Frame, who built the frame in a factory. So it's a kind of hybrid MMC project. Because of the width of the walls, we built part of it in the factory and then ballooned it out on site and filled it with insulation. So, and that's something we developed with them as the supplier. And then obviously, and I'll come on to this, the ability of a timber frame to kind of reduce your carbon impact is huge. And then, as I say, Andrew's already touched on cost, so very kind of low cost for the quality that we achieved. Just very quickly, for those of you who don't know anything about Passive House, you know, a kind of standard build with a gas boiler is producing this sort of level of energy emissions. You know, a lot of properties these days are built with air source heat pumps. And the difference you can see between these different charts is what's called the performance gap. And that is something that Passive House drastically reduces, because you very much get what you designed with Passive House. And I'm sure Sally will expand on that later in the talk. But, you know, just in very simple terms, you can see the difference between where building regs are currently targeting and where you are with Passive House. So very low energy demand. What that means from a fuel poverty point of view or resident point of view is you're looking at a bill of around £150 a year for a 2-bed house, so very low. What that means long term, without that performance gap, is that your energy demand is kind of fairly consistent, whereas, you know, it's almost increased exponentially over time from the point when it was constructed. Just to expand on the kind of Andrew's kind of history of the project, the one thing that we did at competition stage was really look at the local vernacular, in particular the terrace streets of Norwich. So this drawing on the left is some, you know, kind of typical 19th century Victorian terraces with a 14-metre overlooking distance between the fronts and a 14-metre overlooking distance at the backs. And we took that and turned it through 90 degrees with a kind of east-west street direction, which gave us our kind of solar master plan and echoed that local kind of urban grain. And that was really well supported by the planners, but also what it meant was that we got more development on the site by compressing the overlooking distances and still creating kind of good spaces between the buildings, which Harriet will hopefully expand upon. So that's what it looks as a site section. I think critically is, again, very simple takeaway from this presentation is understanding how the sun moves around the site. So I've already sort of mentioned about the kind of east-west and kind of that solar aspect, but also it's understanding, you know, in the winter is how you get the sun into a building and that you don't have one building overshading another. So quick overview of the overall master plan. I think what a lot of people are surprised about with Goldsmith Street is it's a very simple scheme. It's not a kind of very shouty scheme. You've got some terraces of houses with flat blocks on the end. You've got really nice, generous communal garden spaces between terraces where only residents can access. So it's kind of lots of very simple ideas, but just I think the execution and the kind of quality of what we've done is kind of the hard thing to do. Something that is another thing that's worth kind of noting as I flick through these pictures is the spaces between the buildings and how they work. So, you know, architecture doesn't just stop at the building elevation. It's really considering things like your front garden wall, gates. You know, these are south-facing gardens, and I don't think I've ever seen a scheme where front gardens that go directly onto the streets have been so well used by residents. And I think that's testament to the kind of landscape design and the feeling of security by having things as simple as a gate on your front garden that kind of is immediately kind of open to your kitchen. Other little details are things like meter boxes. We've worked really hard to conceal them across the scheme. You know, allowing kind of small spaces outside people's front doors where, you know, residents have within a matter of weeks taken ownership over that tiny little space, which is directly onto the public pavement, and put their own doormat there. And I think this is kind of really lovely and kind of shows that kind of sense of ownership within the scheme. Other things is so the areas to the rear of the properties, these are safe areas for small children to play. So we call them ginnels, but it very much picks up on the idea of kind of access kind of coal alleys around the back of Victorian terraces. So these spaces are all accessible by the residents through the rear of their properties. And, you know, this is a kind of genuine photo of how the space is being used by small children and kind of, you know, allowing residents to get to know each other within this space. There was a point earlier about COVID. I think one of the particular ideas around Goldsmith Street with respect to flats is there's no common parts. So this is quite unusual. You know, a lot of schemes have a lift core and a shared entrance and then a series of flats that go off that space. One of the key issues I believe Norwich has with their flat blocks is the common parts and people doing things in there that they shouldn't be doing. And I think we took that as part of our brief and kind of went, well, look, let's develop a scheme which has no common parts. So each of the flat blocks you can see here at the end of each terrace has a door which directly accesses onto the street. So everyone has their own front door. And I think especially in this current situation with COVID, that that sense of ownership and independence of not having to share a space with other people, I think is, it must be a fantastic kind of place to live versus kind of other situations. So here you can see one of the flat blocks with the floor plan here. So you've got a ground floor flat directly accessed off the street, and then 2 others with this kind of scissor stair on the corner here. Just a quick view of the terrace. And then I really love this photo just in terms of, you know, this is genuinely how the spaces are being used by residents. Just how the building performs against the 2030 targets. I know that's kind of part of the kind of criteria that's been looked at. You know, the energy demand is very low on Goldsmith Street against that, and that is primarily being done by Passive House, and that just by fundamentally reducing your energy demand from the outset. I think what was interesting for us is that we didn't, you know, the focus of our brief was to achieve Passive House. And I think since then, and since the Sterling, there's been very much a focus with the climate emergency on embodied carbon within buildings. And we kind of retrospectively looked at how Goldsmith Street was performing, and it's coming out against the RIBA targets of, you know, very close to their 2030 scheme without us really kind of pushing it. And that's something we're doing on our current schemes. And interestingly, that is primarily due to the timber frame and timber sequestration. And that's kind of water. Sorry, I'm just very conscious of time. So just kind of broadly how the kind of carbon is counted within the project. And sorry. Very quickly, I think thinking about palette of materials, you know, this is a low cost project, and I think we thought very carefully about what materials were specified, their durability and maintenance. So that's something I think is worth as a kind of very quick takeaway. And lastly, I just wrap up on this slide because one of the huge changes that we made during the scheme, you know, it was coming in over budget, and we made a call to change the roofs from zinc to tile. You know, this offered a huge saving to the project. And I think one of the things that worked incredibly well as a process on Goldsmith Street was the value engineering. And I think for me, this kind of sort of says that value engineering can be beautiful. And at this, I'll hand over to Harriet.
Sorry, technically a bit incompetent. I am not at the point I thought I was at. I beg your pardon. Nearly there. Lovely pictures you can see again. And I was lined up on the right page, so apologies. I'm blaming my computer. I'm Harriet Bourne. I am director at BBUK Landscape Architects. We worked with Mikhail from about 2014 onwards, looking at, not surprisingly, landscape and public spaces. And I've started with this rather unbeautiful slide just because I think it's important to understand that however beautiful the houses are, and the houses are very beautiful, if the landscape isn't right, or if the spaces between the buildings isn't right, then it's just never going to work. So, for example, if the play area is in a sea of horrible black rubber crumb tiles, it's not going to be well used because it doesn't feel safe. If the streets aren't overlooked, then they're going to be empty. If the streets aren't designed to take parking, then people are going to park on the pavements, and there's going to be nowhere for people to walk. If there aren't spaces for people to put bins, then the bins are going to sit on the street, and then they're overflowing. And alongside that, another thing that is really important is obviously maintenance. If a scheme isn't maintained properly, it's the buildings will crumble, but the landscape is the first thing that you see. So if there's rubbish on the ground or the trees aren't pruned properly, then the whole place starts to fall apart. And what makes a truly sustainable scheme, not just in terms of building fabric and low-cost heating bills, is the community. If the community isn't truly sustainable, then the scheme is not going to last. So when we look at a project, we start by looking at the way that people are going to use it. One of my very favorite artists is Bruegel, because he centers his work around people with activities, and not just one activity, but a whole variety of activities, which is what you get in real life. So you want to be able to feel safe so that your children can play out on the streets. You want to feel that you've got places where you can meet your neighbors. You want to be able to park your car safely. You might want the car to be able to drain into a space which is going to attenuate the water so you don't get flood issues. And you want to be able to stand and gossip with your neighbors over a fence. And I think on top of that, we want to make sure that the place is enhanced with planting, with appropriate planting, that has an interest all year round, but also has a seasonal interest, so that you get an explosion of colour and flower in the spring and the summer, and then it might die back and not be quite so interesting and diverse and colourful in the winter. But I think particularly in an urban area, seasonal interest is really, really important, and it will also start to bring in insects and butterflies and birds. So this is where we started with Goldsmith Street. We, as I said, started working not on the very initial competition. We came in around 2014-15 and looked at the landscape, which we've kind of very loosely divided into the kind of public routes, the vehicle routes, the pavements, the what we're calling semi-public routes, which is where you might go through a more planted space, which might have local doorstep play for the younger children, through to the semi-private spaces, which are the spaces between buildings, which are only accessible for residents within those terraces that open out onto that space. And then the public open spaces, which connect through to the local context, so the local existing housing, because that's one thing that we felt was really important, that it doesn't sit isolated on its own, this brand new lovely development with lots of architects going to look at it because it's won prizes, but actually it talks to the people that are already living in the area. So the two spaces sitting on the northeast corner and on the southern corner, which is where we've got the kind of formal play area and the informal kind of grassy kickabout area, which connects to, as Andrew mentioned, an open space to the south of the site. I've lost my train of thought. But that's the way we've kind of loosely divided the spaces within the spaces between the building within the site. Another really important thing is that James was saying the front gardens are really well used, which is something that I harp on about a lot, because it's, I think, one of the very few developments we've worked on where people have really occupied and taken over their front gardens. Not just because they're beautifully designed and they're looking onto lovely houses, but I think also the fact that the front gardens are all south facing. So all the front gardens get sunshine all day long, whereas the north facing homes, you step straight in from the street, and they get a slightly larger back garden to compensate for the lack of front garden space. So looking at the spaces that I've kind of classified into your kind of getting around routes, your very public roads. As I said before, we've got south-facing front gardens. In order to bring greenery to the north-facing side of the streets, that's where the majority, well, in fact, that's where all the street trees go, apart from where you get to a junction, and then we have 4 street trees in a kind of quadrant, but generally the parking spaces are broken up with street trees on the north facing side of the road, because they only have very narrow planting slots in front of the housing. The other thing we did with the front gardens was originally they had hedges to separate the front garden from the street. Part of the value engineering exercise was to take the hedges out and put in fencing. The fencing, we've planted ivy up so that they will, when it matures, they will be greened boundaries, but we managed to save a lot of money by taking out hedges and having this kind of fence and climber. As James pointed out, people taking over these spaces for themselves is really charming. So the house number 2 has put up hanging baskets, and actually since those baskets went up, house number 4, 5, 6 and 7 have got them. So actually we've got a whole row of people with their baskets hanging from the porch. Other people have put furniture out in the front where they're sitting and chatting to people as they walk past and their neighbours, and then others have added bedding plants and gnomes to their gardens. So there's a real variety. Unusually, we did a planting scheme for all the front gardens, most of which is staying, but other people have taken what we proposed out and put in brighter coloured or different plants, which I think is also really nice that they've taken ownership.
Harriet, we're a bit short of time. I just wonder whether you could speed up to make sure Sally gets a good hearing as well.
Of course.
Thank you.
Ginnels, which I think James has talked about already, they are all the back gardens open out into the Ginnels. As you can see by the right hand slide, open the gate, the children are out, they get to know their neighbours without having to go on play dates, which is the way that I was brought up, but that was a very long time ago. So, and I think my children certainly didn't have that opportunity, and I think it's fantastic that the kids in Goldsmith Street do. The semi-public spaces, which are the non-vehicular route through the site, have got doorstep play. This encourages people to walk through the site rather than drive, because there's something for the children to do on their way through. It also is an opportunity for the community to meet people that aren't in the terraces that open onto their Ginnel. They're actually available for everybody across the whole site. Then the play areas, which sit, as I said previously, on the edge of the site, so that this is the edge of Goldsmith Street, our development, and then these buildings here are existing flats and homes that have access through to these it's very low-key play, but it's a more formal play area. The tree was one of the trees that was removed from the next door site, so Norwich kept that for us, and we then had that put into the play area as a climbing natural play feature. And then the more informal kickabout area, which is centered on a couple of existing trees, which one of which actually died, so we replaced that with 2 further trees on this site. We've planted about 5,500 new bulbs, and I'm really hoping that lockdown restrictions lift so that we can go and have a look at those coming up this year. I think, Andrew, you'll be pleased. Yeah, that's it. And we love this slide so much. Me and James have both used it to finish off our presentation. So I'll stop sharing and hand over to Sally.
Hi guys, I'm really aware of time, Andy, so I'm going to do like super quick speed. So we were the Passive House consultants on this project, and a huge background in kind of low energy design. We don't really care about the Passive House sticker. It's all about the, we feel genuinely completely freaked out about the climate emergency, and we see this as a really practical way of making change. And there's 2 things that I'm going to tell you about today, which were things that we implemented on Goldsmith Street, which are really relevant to the design challenge and what you're doing today. So we're gonna go through all the amazing stuff we did on detailed design and site and all that and aftercare and everything else, and we're just going to focus on the initial design stages. So this is what we got when we started in terms of the kind of site stuff. James has described that quite eloquently. So they kind of already had the terraces, and it was already the kind of site set out was fairly kind of well produced, and up there's north. And these are the two things I'm going to go through. The first one is kind of form and complexity, and the second one is about glazing. The first thing, form and complexity, I'm hoping that, seeing as you've been kind of nailed down by Tabitha and had Passive House ram down your neck fairly significantly, you really get how important thinking about how much surface area you have. You know, surface area, heat loss is a function of surface area. You have more surface area, you have more heat loss. So that's kind of like Passive House starter pack. I'm assuming that you've all got that. So when we started looking at this scheme, this is what it looked like to when we first got involved. We were pretty happy. We had a load of terraces and there was a lot of repetition. And this is the first point that I really want to nail home, is about when you're looking at a kind of quality product, I really want you to be careful about the amount of complexity that you put in a project. Okay, that's the most important thing, the most important tool that you have. All that complexity adds cost to the scheme in terms of if you want it done well. So if you want something done well, having a lot of repetition, huge opportunity to do a good job of it. So we're pretty happy with this. There are a couple of things that made it quite tricky though. In terms of form particularly, one of the things that the kind of layout meant that the front to back distance was actually quite short. So it meant that because the buildings were kind of wide, it meant that there was quite a lot of surface area. So the form factor wasn't quite as good as we kind of originally expected. And just to put that in context, in comparison to another scheme that we were looking at, which we just completed, Raynham in Essex, a really lovely scheme, which had a really narrow width of it, but very long front to back, that the difference there in heating energy was about 1.5 kilowatt hours, which in comparison to our Passive House maximum of 15 was quite considerable. So there was a long discussion about what the impact was of kind of changing the shape and looking at the plan overall. But in the end, we decided to we decided to stick with where we'd got to in the original proposal. So the kind of whole Passive House methodology is not about kind of enforcing design changes, but it's making informed decisions and using the modelling to give you the information to decide whether something's right or not. One of the other things that we looked at in terms of complexity was this particular detail here, where we've got a kind of inset doorway, is really problematic. We've got lots of the glazing meeting each other, the glazing meeting the floor, the top of the glazing and the wall meeting the roof, lots of really complex details. And the conclusion of this was to remove this and to create that. And I think this is one of the most lovely design solutions. So the fabric design is really straightforward. The line of the fabric just runs straight through there, and yet we've got these beautiful porches which sit right onto the pavement. So, you know, that to me is a massive success. And there were some other things that kind of along similar lines that we did. In a similar way, we ended up with the insulation line going up and along the pitch. It would have been better from an energy point of view to have it going straight along the ceiling, again reducing the kind of form factor and meaning we had less heat loss area. But this was decided to have a real value to the scheme, so this is where we went with it. So you can see the kind of, this is not always saying going with the best energy, but kind of, you know, kind of the debate is the important part of this. The repetition part of this, all of these houses are pretty much identical, and then we've got a few more houses which are pretty similar, but then the complexity really comes in with the flats where there's a huge amount of variation. And this meant that this was, unfortunately, because of that amount of variation, that's where the time was. So the houses rather, lots of repetition, very simple, beautiful. The flats are very beautiful too, but complexity meant that they spent a lot more time working on those. So really pick carefully which areas you want to work on. And then super carefully, I just want to go over really quickly about glazing, particularly orientation. This is, we were super happy with this facing north and south, not because of the energy balance stuff, but this is to do with summer comfort, okay? In terms of summer comfort, it's much easier to deal with buildings that face north and south or have their windows north and south in comparison to east and west. So yeah, we were properly like big smiley face with that. But there were some things that weren't so great. So the design was kind of principally aimed at a lot of glass. And I think that the area, where we are at the moment with the future climate predictions, we really have to consider glass as the kind of the icing on the cake. It's the really sparkly stuff that brings a building alive. It creates the most beautiful environments inside, connects us to outside, gives us fresh air, all these things, massively positive. But at the same time, it is the gold sprinkling. We can't just completely adorn our buildings with it anymore and expect it to make them look beautiful. So we have to work a lot harder, okay? But really, this kind of percentage of glass is really not appropriate in any setting whatsoever anymore. So there's a lot of discussion then, you know, which areas should we be putting glass onto? Is that valuable? You know, are we getting the most out of it? And that's the kind of discussion that we want to see. So there was a lot of that went on throughout the scheme. And in a similar way on the flats, when we started, there was a glass everywhere and a lot of work to kind of make them a lot simpler. Boom, that's it.
That's brilliant. You took me by surprise there, Sally.
Sorry.
Anyway, that was terrific, and thank you very much all four speakers. And sorry if I harried it a bit at a certain point. I mean, there's such a lot to say about this project, and there's such a lot to learn from it that I don't think we're short of any questions. I've certainly got quite a few. I've been asked by Tab though, just to sort of restate where Sunderland are in terms of their own ambition and what's expected, I suppose, from the competition itself. And I suppose what we just heard in terms of this particular project is pretty encapsulated in it, creating a new carbon neutral urban quarter in the heart of a city, which is pretty much what this is. Delivering homes and communities. I think that's really important, that you're not just talking about a new home and how that might technologically be more sophisticated. It's about people, you know, how you bring people together. So that was pretty well articulated in the project and the way it was articulated. And variety, flexibility, modern methods of construction. I think there's some hidden gems in there which you don't actually see from the outside in terms of how things have been simplified and made a sort of a system approach of flexibility and repetition. Low carbon digital technology, I'm sure that will be featured somewhere. But those are the sort of issues Sunderland are really looking for. I suppose overlaid on top of that is the off-site manufacture piece, which perhaps this project doesn't exemplify, but the next one certainly will. Anyway, I'm going to ask a couple of questions which came out of the chat. One is about post-occupancy. I think a really good point. And so perhaps one for James. One for the team.
We're very excited, I think, off the back of, you know, our work at Clay Fields to do a piece of post-occupancy analysis on Goldsmith Street. And, you know, it's strangely to say this, but, you know, unfortunately, the Sterling Prize kind of got in the way of us doing that. And there was a lot of press at the time. And I think we agreed with the clients that actually we should probably give residents a bit of a break from architects and consultants coming to visit. And to be honest, actually, you know, with COVID now over the last year, I feel like we're probably 2 years on from the first residents moving in this summer. And I think doing a piece of work this summer, ironically, is probably going to be more valuable than us doing it a year ago, because I think we'll really get a sense of you know, what it's been like to live in. But I think all of the anecdotal post-occupancy work that we have done, you know, and that is just through speaking to residents that we've gotten to know, has been really useful. And I think the big takeaway for me has been that, you know, the passive house side of things has actually worked. And I think that is, it seems like a really obvious thing to say, you know, of course it worked. But, you know, I think Sally's laughing, but, you know, I think passive house is the standard that actually genuinely delivers what it says on the tin. And, you know, those low fuel bills, as long as people are living in the properties right, you know, it actually works. And I think we just want to probably now check and test with Warm that, you know, people are living in these houses correctly. And what I mean by correctly is, you know, it is a different way of living. And then I think there's a second part to the POE, which is the softer stuff. And what I mean by that is, you know, what's worked from a design point of view, you know, and there's, you know, there's obviously a kind of multitude of things that we could investigate within that. I don't know whether anyone else wants to jump in. Andrew.
Yeah,
and just quickly add, Sally was very keen that we did some post-occupancy analysis, and unfortunately we didn't get around to it. We have also been speaking to the University of East Anglia, and they're very keen with their sort of behavioural science department to look at some of the sort of more soft aspects around education, health, people's sort of sense of community and those kind of things. We were talking to them before COVID, but we're keen to pick that up as well, so that we can have a look at the community aspect as well as the performance of buildings.
That's really interesting. I think it's also not just about the technical performance of the buildings and how the occupants adapt to a different sort of regime. It's also about the social aspects, and I think there's an awful lot that you can learn from, you know, just a feedback from the social interaction that the master plan allows, and the particular way in which the layout is enabling that to happen in a very successful way. This is a team question, really. Not all sites lend themselves to an east-west orientation for housing. Is it essential for Passive House to be an east-west and a sort of south-facing roofscape? How can more complicated master plans still deliver on placemaking as well as delivering a Passive House solution?
One for Sally to pick up, I think.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Just pass that off.
I think we asked you that very question, didn't we, Sally? But I'll let you plug the gap.
Yeah, so I was trying to make the real point about in terms of the kind of the solar gain in winter and the kind of the heating energy bit of it. To be honest, it's marginal, you know, making something east-west versus north-south in terms of the glazing. It doesn't really make any difference. The thing where it does make a difference is to do with the summertime and the ease at which you can, both the amount of solar gain that you get and the ease at which you can shade that solar gain as well. So this means that on buildings that face east-west, we have to work harder. You are more constrained about the glazing that you put on it in comparison to those that face north-south. So it's about, you know, summer comfort is all about assessing risk, and the orientation is one risk aspect, but certainly I would not enforce a kind of north-south housing marching down the street thing if that didn't suit the environment at all. And that there are we've got several developments. We're just handing over development now in Camden, which has got 2 large blocks which face east-west, so it's completely achievable, and that is yeah.
That's good to hear. That's excellent. I think that's something that's important for those listening in, that you know, not all master plans should be or need to be orientated in a specific way to achieve Passive House. So it's really good to know. My final one was, I was fascinated by the embodied carbon statistic that James set out, and you know, there's a lot of clamouring at the moment for setting those sort of metrics in building regulation, making it more of a requirement, and you know, some disappointment being expressed about embodied carbon not being part of the future home standards. So just be interested to have a commentary on that, really. And you know, I'm in government. I can take it.
You need to make plans then, Sally, or
Yeah, we'll just gang up, do the scissor thing. Yeah, I think absolutely it should be. It absolutely should be a part of. And the thing that's so great is that this is actually, it's really easy to account for. So we need to have the a kind of agreed standards of how we do it, but ultimately it's a number thing. So it's relatively easy for us to start putting together these numbers, understanding them, and putting value against them. And one of the things that I'd say is really positive about Goldsmith Street is that the all of the things that we're doing to make the building more efficient from an energy point of view and in-use energy means that the use of materials is really careful. And therefore, that's one of the reasons why we've got so low embodied carbon, is because we've used everything really efficiently. So that kind of efficient design, plays both ways. James.
Very good, excellent.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think one of the difficulties is, the designers I think are grappling with at the moment is how to integrate this kind of carbon process into their design process. And I think some of these slides are really good, and that's both in terms of energy and use, but also in terms of actually how you design and build a thing. And I think, as a practice, the schemes that we're bringing forward now, as I said in the presentation, hands up, it was not the #1 objective when we were developing Goldsmith Street. It was about how to achieve passive house on a budget. And I think now we're delivering a number of schemes with York City Council and in London for housing associations, where actually it is very much more front and centre, and we're having to really think about how we're designing these buildings. And I think it's something that we've got to get to grips with as designers. And I think it's something that actually, if it was a target that we had to hit, we're doing this by choice at the moment, really. But actually, if it was a definite target like building regs, then people would get on board and it would become much more part of the process.
If I could just come in and add as well, Andy, from government's point of view, if they are kind of keen to put this in and make it targets, I think there's a real opportunity there to boost the supply chain in the UK. Obviously, on Goldsmith Street, we had a number of materials that came from Europe, because there wasn't that real supply chain in the UK. And if we can build that up by making everybody kind of use those materials, I think that will lower carbon use as well.
Yeah, super. Okay. And just a final comment from me, because we do need to move on to the next set of speakers. But one of the nicest things I enjoyed about Goldsmith Street is the use of just a traditional street in the right way, with the car in the right place, with the right level of detail to the street, the right level of landscape. The landscape absolutely enhances the project. And, it'd be good for learning as to how you persuaded your highways authorities to adopt more innovative approaches to highways design, instead of the standard look of blacktop and 2-metre wide pavements. So well done on that. I think that's terrific. So Andrew, do you want to make a quick point about that?
Yeah, just very, very quickly. It did help that up until last year, Norwich City Council was the highways department on behalf of county. So that did help those conversations.
Okay. Anyway, well done to all of you. Thank you very much. And we're going to move on now to the next set of speakers. I'm delighted also to be introducing this one, because it's part of the Home 2030 outcome, and I'm not sure who I'm handing over to. Is it Judith? Judith, is it yourself?
It's to Will.
To Will. Sorry, Will. My apologies. Will, over to you. Do you want to take us through this? Maybe explain a little bit about the background to the competition as well, if you wouldn't mind.
I'll just quickly share my screen, and while I'm trying to do that, just say thank you ever so much for that presentation on Goldsmith Street, because it's a really fascinating project, and making something so difficult look so simple is a real credit to you all, so thank you. Now hopefully somewhere here, if I can just slideshow from the beginning. So, I mean, the first thing just to point out, so my name is Will Mawson. I'm an architect, Mawson Kerr Architects, and this was a real big team effort. So, delighted to have on the call this evening Judith Sykes, Director at Useful Projects, Sarah Jones-Morris from Landsmith Associates, and Andy Downey, Elliott Wood, and a developer, if you like, but they are very much an ethical developer, and we were brought together with really the creme de la creme of other consultants, and I think it was really the discussions that happened when you bring all these different thinking people together, that it brings a real cocktail that leads to success. So the other person, I really should point out is a colleague of mine, Matt Glover, who I'm going to take all the glory for these images, but he spent many hours penning some fantastic illustrations to this. So the competition is really about a real big problem that we've got in the UK, and it seems to be kind of quite specific to the UK, although there are huge climate emergencies around the planet. But it's about housing and how we do kind of the volumetric housing. And obviously, Goldsmith Street aside, there is some, unfortunately, just some huge problems. The first slide is just picking up that the housing crisis. We can't deliver homes fast enough at high quality. Alongside that, the general volumetric house builders will tell us that they can't deliver homes to meet net zero carbon in a financially viable way. And our kind of model of suburban life and other elements to it mean that to try and create sustainable lifestyles, and probably something that, having spent the last 12 months in lockdown and a COVID scenario, we see the importance of well-being and the whole space between the houses and that kind of external environment is absolutely crucial in terms of how we use the sunlight and the spaces for growing things and a whole host of other things. Our mission statement at the start was we need to do something disruptive to solve this problem and stand for something different. Now, the way we came about it, we knew that there's, as picked up in the Goldsmith Street and the presentations there, which Sally mentioned, housing doesn't need to be particularly complex form. It just needs to be getting all the simple rules correct. But part of it that clearly is broken was the element about how you procure housing, which is something that Judith will pick up and was kind of an innovative part of our solution. This was, the competition was run in two parts, and it's worth picking up about the competition. The competitions within architecture and the construction world, some people see them as quite sort of divisive, and other people hands down say don't do them. But personally, we get a lot of enjoyment out of competitions, but also research. It's very important to use these as a research vessel if you want to take them seriously. And also within this particular drawing, which was done for our first stage of the competition, there's actually a site underneath there, which is actually the site you'll be using for your competition design, which is the Sunderland Vaux site. Although it kind of got morphed a little bit as things moved on. I don't know if you'll get a bowling green in there, but certainly the essence of the site was there. And we used that as a test piece to try and maximize density and really push the boundaries of how we're going to do the layout on this particular piece. Amongst all the noise that's going on this amazing drawing, if you strip it back, there's actually some quite simple forms and repeated as well. And I think that was a real key part of what we wanted to try and do, was to look at not creating any crazy architecture. It's really pushing the little pieces in there, the moments at front doors, how intergenerational living can happen in very simple kind of typologies. And much like we see in the beloved Georgian and Victorian terraces, how these can stand the test of time and have multiple lifetimes. So as well as the key themes of the 2030 competition, which were all to do with intergenerational and people living a lot longer now, and the climate emergency, we wanted to make something that was deliverable. It had to be affordable, otherwise no one's ever going to take it up. Exemplary, as in hitting all the gold standards, which will get picked up later. Disruptive in the sense that we have to try and do something about what is happening in the volumetric house building scenario, and scalable to be able to take that on. We know that one-off houses can be done absolutely beautifully, but how do we do that at volume? A site was picked for the stage 2, and just to very quickly pick out, this is just to the south of Nottingham, the red quarter there. Within that, it's a green greenfield site essentially, which has already been targeted with a master plan. So these were conditions that we were given, and the red oblong there was the piece that we had to look at. Something that was really crucial in this was looking at how we reduced cars on the site, and Sarah may well pick this up in terms of how we looked at the hierarchy of the streets and how we could quite simply take cars out without telling people they couldn't have cars. But we'll kind of get into that in a bit more detail. To be able to look at that single couple of plots that were in that, we also looked at the slightly wider master plan just to look at the scale and how we could create a community, because it's very difficult to design a community when you don't know exactly who's going there, but it's certainly easy to get it wrong. So we just wanted to look at getting the right mix of uses and how we can promote the right uses at ground floor, perhaps small startup businesses, and get the right mix of housing. So there's different types of people have got options perhaps to move within their own streets and really create a sense of people wanting to live there. So this was kind of just going through a number of different criteria, looking at how we home in on the eventual master plan. This diagram, we worked in all sorts of different programs. This was a quick SketchUp, to be fair, done by John Norden, who is a key part of the client team, and he was looking at how, with a simple typology, can you have different ways of stacking that up, of making it so that perhaps an elderly couple could have the ground floor, say, and a young family the upstairs. So this was just looking at that kind of interplay of volumes. This image, which will be repeated a little later on, is just one of just show how we were working really collaboratively, which was quite difficult given the COVID kind of scenario. But looking at using, it was Jamboard in this particular application, where we had base drawings that everyone would get together on a Friday at 10 o'clock, and we'd have a really kind of in-depth couple of hours sketching on top of different people's drawings and trying to work out how we could really maximize every square meter that was in the master plan. So just kind of homing in on the eventual piece of the site that we looked at in a lot more detail. This is one of the drawings that went into the submission, and we just wanted to pick up the green, which is obviously the green space, which we wanted to really maximize to give the potential for this to have some eco-diversity and to allow the opportunity for people growing their own vegetables, and the community spaces, which Sarah will touch on in a lot more detail. But essentially there were two clusters of housing that we were asked to look at in more detail. And then, as Andy picked up, we really zoomed in on one of the houses in a lot more detail into the granular fabric of how that got put together. And this is that front street, if you like, which picked up an apartment building. Again, a very important typology, very good in terms of form factor when looking at energy loss and all those kinds of technical aspects of the passive response. And as was picked up before, we were really keen to try and maximize how sunlight could get into the backs of houses, how we could create these little perhaps slightly less drafty spaces that maybe people could create their own kind of games and play space within, but also activating corners and all the key things to create a good place. But crucial to it was not allowing too much car penetration within there, so it didn't become a sea of tarmac. And an image just really homing in. You can zoom in a number of times on this to the point of just seeing all the different characters, but it was really picking up the point about to make a community in a space that's had nothing but green fields. We had to really challenge how the different uses were going to happen. And amongst the group, we played out scenarios of how different people might work there, what is the right mix of people living there, and look at the material opportunities as well. It's worth saying that there wasn't particularly a material that we was the go-to, apart from obviously timber wherever possible. But we're looking at the real carbon capture discussion, which Judith will pick up in quite a lot more detail. An image here is just to show another way a lot of hand drawing was done during the process. So just to give you a flavour, it isn't all computer imagery. There's a lot of every format of kind of creativity to really push the conversation along. And one of the obligatory CGI images, a fantastic image by Picture Plane that just kind of brought the thing to life from the more cartoon images that you saw, but hopefully given a sense of place that's within that. I'll pass over to Judith just for these next slides.
Thanks, Will. I'd forgotten how much I miss our Friday morning jam sessions with that image. It's brilliant. So two of the things that were core to this proposal, as Will has mentioned, is how do you deliver at scale, but also how do we engage the range of different people, the range of different actors in the delivery of those homes. So right through from customers through the supply chain and for future residents. And so our key enabling platform is a digital platform which really does this. So if you go to the next slide. So our digital platform does this linking function in four key ways. First, on the left-hand side, it supports the design and configuration of the master plan scheme and homes. It gives homeowners in particular some choice and ability to customise their homes and also their community through the community builder. The second thing it does is connects into and supports the creation of a marketplace. So a marketplace of products that can be configured to suit your home. And really importantly, that marketplace and those components include material or product data with environmental performance. So whilst in the competition scheme, we chose to illustrate a more focused proposal based on timber, the idea of this marketplace is that it can be technology agnostic. And so when we have more decarbonised production of products, and you can see innovations coming in steel and concrete, or more technical solutions alongside biosolutions, you can then procure those through the marketplace platform. The third component is the assembly on site, and Andy will talk a little bit more about the build barn and how that works. But importantly, that these components all have digital material and product information that enables them to be recirculated and repurposed and reused at the end of its life. And so the concept of the remanufacturing as well is included as part of this. And then the fourth component is that feedback loop from what we're calling big POE. So as Andy was sort of saying earlier, it's not just about energy, but this is also a chance to capture those wider social aspects and how the place works, and then feed that information back into future design and future developments. So that's really was key to, I think what the judges said was core to our sort of winning submission was this digital platform. And if you go to the next slide. Sorry, I meant to say as well that digital platform may seem like it's sort of very emergent technology, but that technology does exist, and particularly things like the configurator. We use that in different guises, and I'm working on a project which is using it for an infrastructure project at the moment. So it is very deliverable as a piece. So carbon performance was absolutely critical. This is a very similar slide to the one that James showed earlier, mapping the Goldsmith Street to the Letty and Reba Challenge targets. And we have done the same here. And I think what the Goldsmith project showed was that actually what we're suggesting is not undeliverable. You know, we can deliver against those challenge targets. And what we really need to do is work out how to deliver it at scale, and hence our platform approach, and was our mechanism for achieving this. So of course we are mapping well against all of those RIBA and LETI carbon challenge targets. If you go to the next slide. And so it's the platform, but it's also this component approach, and the really careful choice of materials through that sort of product declaration statements, and that helps us achieve those standards. But it's also coupled with the very specific detailing about how these components go together as well. And Andy might talk a little bit more about the plug and play approach, so that when you're putting together these homes, it's really easy to achieve that environmental performance that we're talking about. And if we go to the next slide, you know, whilst this was a competition, we did get down to, you know, the real detail about how these components work, and a component approach works to resolve, you know, challenging pieces like avoiding thermal bridging within homes. So if we go to the next slide. So the other component of life cycle design, and Matt sort of touched, so Will touched on this earlier, was the ability to be able to reconfigure spaces and provide choice no matter where you are in your life, in your life, and what your needs within your life are at a particular time. So what this diagram does, probably perhaps too subtly, but it just shows you how you can use different spaces within those homes for different needs. So be that for home office or homeschooling or a workshop, or to convert your upper floors into a flat that you can let out when once your kids have moved out. So that sort of ability to be able to reconfigure spaces to suit lifetime needs and have different sort of tenure types as well within it was absolutely critical part of that design. And that's because if you go to the next slide, as Will has said, that one of the key themes of this competition was age-friendly and inclusive living, and so that sort of central theme there of adaptability is key, but supported with you know, latest technology to help independent living. But fundamentally, Sarah will touch on this a little bit more, is about the landscape and the spaces that you create outside of the houses as well that brings people together. And this next slide just shows how some of those principles were developed in an early sketch. If yeah, thanks, Will. And so this is an early sketch showing how that reconfiguration space works, but also how we've designed in some really important details, really simple details though, things like the modern day sort of stoop, a seat where people can sit out on the front porch and watch the world go by, or the barn door, which you can leave open, so you're sort of connected but not necessarily connected. So we did work through a lot of these details, so it worked at the master plan scale, but also at the detailed scale. And then I think if you go to the next slide, and I've talked a little bit about this as well, so I won't dwell on it, but you know, the ensuring that we created homes that could incorporate the latest technology and do so in a way that can be sort of really easily reconfigured. So all of the servicing and the systems can be easily reconfigured to sort of suit changes in technology. Right. And whilst again it was also just a competition, we did invest actually as a team in securing accreditation reviews against Homes Quality Mark, the Happy Standards, Building for a Healthy Life, Homes Plus, and Building with Nature, because we felt that this collection of accreditations sort of touched on all of the core themes of the competition, and it was important for us to get that sort of third party view on what the Home of 2030 and the Plus Home particularly was delivering. I think on that note, I'm handing over to Andy to talk about the materials and build barn.
Next slide, Rob. Good evening, everybody. We change the slide.
Sorry, I didn't hear the prompt.
Thank you. Right. The whole competition, as the rest of the team have alluded to, I think we became known as the Browns for our sessions and our presentation. Was really one of absolute collaboration. So engineers, architects, clients, everybody chipping in on every aspect of it. But one of the key important things for me on this was that we all learned very quickly to not focus on answers, because the answers are at one level quite straightforward. There's lots of answers for building housing of this type at one level. But what are the difficult questions that maybe have not been raised properly so far? So we were always good at asking each other difficult questions about how we should be going about this. And one aspect of that was making the project materials agnostic. And that might look like a bit of a cop-out when it's quite obvious the answer, where you build it out of timber. But maybe timber isn't the answer. Maybe some of these places, it's a different material, or there's a different material that will be available tomorrow. So if we were really smart and we create the right type of platform, then other types of emerging materials could use this simple method. And so we quickly started to focus on the pieces that Judith mentioned, which is a frame and filler, or what we ended up with, structure and skin. And it looks in that image there quite like, well, why are you repeating that? It looks like you've got a big frame and then you're putting a frame inside it. But every time we reappraised it and took it back apart, it actually works, because today, one of our own projects in our office at the moment, I found out just a couple of days ago, there was more timber in holding the cladding together than what there was in the frame itself. So a very simple diagram of a chassis, a big frame, and then a filler, and with a variety of different materials. Next. Right, so I've just touched on this these simple, very simple componentry, and we started to look as well of much simpler ways of connecting things, drawing from the mighty IKEA and their very clever connects between things with furniture that are hugely efficient in terms of use of material, and they perform well. So rather than just reaching for the answer, which could be a whole load of galvanized metal bracketry, what are the simple things that we could use with modern methods of construction to join our components together and allow them to be removed and replaced or repurposed in the future? There's another slide here showing how these sections can push in and be taken apart. And we spent a lot of time again just thinking about how would you actually unfix something, or would the fixings be lost forever within layers and layers of plasterboard and insulation, which is the reality. Next. I'm going to talk about the weather now, because one of the things that when you start to talk about modern methods of construction, you also have to realise what the weather is like in the UK and many other places. And I've just got to check my numbers here. I always want to get the stats right, but the average number of wet days in the UK is 133 per year. So that's pretty much 1/3 of your build time will be impacted by the weather. Add some hot weather in the summer. My brother lays bricks. Very difficult to lay bricks in July and August these days because it's too hot. So what do you do about this weather that's impacting trying to produce something of high quality? Well, a modern method of addressing it would be to try and remove the weather from the equation. So we started to have a look around at different industries, and we tripped over somebody from rock and roll, essentially, from the business of putting on stadium events. And again, I've got a little quote here from this firm called ESG Global Solutions, and they said quite early on, the construction industry simply don't understand us. We work in hours, not weeks or months, and we always finish on time. And they just had this refreshing approach to making whatever you wanted, building it quick, and being able to take it away or change it with complete ease at the right price. You know, a sort of message that doesn't exist in the construction industry. So the next slide. So from that, we used essentially the build barn itself is a series of pre-made components from the workshop that was just a few kilometres away, as it turned out, from the site in Nottingham. We also added to this gantries with robotic arms, and there should be some other robots that could be spinning around within the space. Now, that at one level could be a little bit future gazing, because the real gain here was that we took weather out of the equation. So in theory, if we wanted to sweat this asset, we could work this site 365 days a year. And the benefit of that is that it might suit workers' routines at home. It could be that you could spend more time at home with children, then do a later shift. You could work through the night if that suited you. And what the end result of all of that was that it completely changes the amount of time it takes to erect these buildings. So rather than saying, oh, you might save a bit of weather, well, you might save an awful lot of weather, as in all of it, and condense the program by a factor of 3 or 4. I can't remember what we finally came up with, but we had a bit of fun trying to work out what factor we could condense the program by, but it was absolutely enormous. Is there a next slide, Will? Okay, maybe just go back one actually, because the technology behind the build barn as well was that actually it didn't need foundations. So insofar as it just relied upon its own temporary foundations screwed into the ground and then removed when you'd finished using it. Because every single aspect of what this business did was all about getting in quickly, putting something up, making it super efficient, and then getting away quickly and efficiently as well. And again, all of the terminology that they used was very different to what you'd find from a construction industry business, perhaps if you asked them to provide a large cover over a building. So a very refreshing approach that suited modern methods of construction. And then everything else became not just more possible, but significantly better once you've created this clean, dry, well-lit environment.
It's probably worth saying that it's not tarmac that's down there on the ground. These were kind of rolled out mats, again, like you'd see in event industry, that would allow workers, and potentially, fairly muddy sites just to work at full time, and then it could get rolled back up and used elsewhere.
There was another slide, it's not in this deck, but we also wanted this as well to be able to look in and see what was happening. So rather it becoming something where something happened that might be dangerous, or you're not allowed to see what's going on. We wanted to celebrate the theatre of making these things, so people could, you could have a viewing gallery and you could experience the homes being built, and also see some of the emerging technology in terms of the robots, a version of Spot the Dog that will be checking everything, or the robotic arms assisting with erecting and positioning the panels on the building. So again, technology that was already in existence, and we were using parts of it to help make these homes better.
So passing over to Sarah now to pick up the greenery on the landscape.
Hi, so hello everybody. So I had several hats on this project. I was a landscape architect, part urban designer, but also I was the building with nature assessor as well, which Mark Southgate's very usefully put the link in to know a bit more about that, about green infrastructure, benchmarking and assessment accreditation. So there's a lot of discussion here about climate change and about low carbon, but I think we mustn't forget there's also a biodiversity emergency. We've really got to think about things in terms of mutual benefit rather than just hitting one benefit of low carbon. We've got to think about mutual benefits. And the approach on this particular project we looked at was evidence and very much like evidence-led and systems. And to have systems, you have to think of this as an ecosystem for humans and for nature to coexist. And for that to happen, you have to work in a collaborative manner whereby you're talking with engineers and architects, etc., about how this can all work together. They're not mutually exclusive. And so, do you want to go to the next slide, Will? So we started thinking about things. The three headings that Building with Nature have is well-being, so health and that impact that includes movement, active travel, wildlife. That's not just biodiversity, but the wider connections, etc. as well. And water. This is a really crucial point about water. It's not just about a flood. It's also about water quality and about how we reuse it, etc. So we were starting to look at that and about what are the specific focus that we want to look, what is the priority of this particular project? And it's interesting, I think it was touched upon on Goldsmith's presentation previously, was things, for example, about wanting to have sort of diverse landscape, but also creating more sort of front gardens, to concentrate on front gardens and design of that, which I'll touch upon a bit later. Also about 8 to 80 cities, which is like creating cities and places that are suitable for an 8-year-old to an 80-year-old. And I know we're talking about age friendly, but this is all ages. You know, that if we were talking about, you know, the layering of things, particularly in COVID at the moment, we need to think about not just play for children, but play for adults too. You know, we need that. And also about the aspects to do with habitat connectivity. Once we touch upon the fact that in the future, maybe we'd have less cars, what are streets? Are they for cars? No, they're for people. And why they could become extensions of parks, they could become a whole new thing. And I say new, it's not new, but it's new to us now. And so, but there's also other aspects underneath that, the infrastructure, like healthy soils and what we do with waste and, you know, soft over hard landscape, you know, that hit things like urban heat island effect, etc. And think about what's local and the importance of size, etc. So we go to the next slide. So we've seen this a bit earlier, but what I like about this sketch is just showing how like we're starting to knit together all these different aspects. Like one of the things we really discussed, which seems really boring, but it's really important, and that's about waste. What do we do with our waste? How do we go to the bin? How, you know, how's recycling done? You know, if we all individually have those things from front gardens, then our front gardens become cluttered. They become just an unusable space. So why don't we make it communal? It's the same with bikes and storage. Why don't we make them a real feature rather than something that's hidden away and squirreled somewhere? But this releases then space to do other things. And one of the aspects that was touched upon, I think, again, in the previous presentation and in this one, is about, we have a big public health responsibilities as designers. And, you know, those social aspects, how that's all going to work and tie in is really important in terms of not just master planning, but also the nitty gritty micro detail. So we started looking at the hierarchy of how these streets, etc., will connect, not just within the site, but beyond the site, because that is a key aspect, not just from humans, but from nature as well. Do you want to move to the next slide? So we started to draw out these particular topics, like what is it? And you can see how it starts to knit together these interrelationships, like the focus of a diverse landscape being important in terms of health and well-being, how children's-led play is also a relationship, as well as the social cohesion aspect related to how public health data works, etc. So move to the next one. I'm just aware of time. I could go on talking about this forever, and I know we have time. Go to the next one. So, and you know, that interrelationship is also, you can see how we started looking at sort of like how those communal gardens could work, and how the private gardens and the front garden spaces work as well. Because at the end of the day, people want back to this diverse landscape aspect of like the communal garden. The great selling point to it for people is you have this broad space whereby, which instead of like just being hundreds of you know, closed board fences, which you see in so many housing developments, you've actually got something meaningful. But also it's a social aspect, but also allowing people some private space too. You need to have that mix. Some people want that privacy, some people want that shared space. And we looked in quite a bit of detail in terms of the microclimate aspect to that as well, but I know we haven't got time. Moving on. And but also just sort of against this idea of growth, future growth, and sort of like ideas in terms of instead of having just sort of leftover spaces, these become meaningful spaces that sort of like really sort of tie in different components. Like, for example, I love the little detail of these sketches of little play areas about incidental spaces where people can use for playing outside. I know where I live here, a lot of people play in the summer dominoes, and you see it's really, really fast game, but they just bring their chairs and seats out to do it. It activates things, it keeps things lively. Don't I move to the next slide? But the other thing we really, really mustn't forget in all of this is about soil. There's no point aiming for like health and growing vegetables and biodiversity if you've got really rubbish soil. And I think that we've really got to consider this because it's something that's underplayed and forgotten. And I've been on so many sites where they just dump a load of rubbish soil, or they think is rubbish soil, without realizing that there's this whole aspect you can think about. And there's one particular point I'd really like to pick out about soils is we were considering about how things like, is it possible that the compost that's created within these neighborhoods can be part of this a sort of contributing to the ecosystem and the soil, health of the soil too. Should we go to the next slide? So this is one of the ones where we really are starting to think about the detail of microclimate. So we're sort of like having tree planting, for example, on the southwest, so that you created a microclimate of warmth around vegetable fruit growing areas, but without shade. So that's I'm not explaining it particularly well, but you can see there's sort of like planting at the back and shade, but also it meant that you're shading buildings behind. And this touches what I'm talking about by mutual benefits, because the shading of building then reduces the amount of cost in terms of if you're thinking about temperature fluctuations, etc. But you're also creating a habitat for biodiversity aspect and from a health benefit too. Do you want to go to the next slide? And you can see how we started incorporating that with water as well. I mean, just to touch upon the fact that one of my other hats that I do is about quiet spaces and impact of noise pollution. And water is a really fantastic way of sort of neutralizing that. It's a psychological effect, it's not a physical one, but it's also in terms of a benefit in terms of people's vision of seeing water, we're drawn to it. That is our human nature to do that. Do you want to move to the next slide? I think we're nearly there. And you can see how I was touching about water, about the interaction of water. But when I was talking about systems, what I mean is this. Could the water from the building be stored under the road and then released when it's hot so that the trees absorb that water and reduce the temperature? Then you've got a connection between the building and the landscape. And this is what they've done in Lyon, in a part of Lyon. It's not something that's This is not something that's pie in the sky. This is actually happening. Where it gets too hot, they release the water and that reduces the microclimate. If you reduce the microclimate, it has a bigger impact on the macroclimate. So let's go to the next one.
Can you speed up a bit now, Sarah, please?
Yeah, I can whiz through these ones. As you can see, we have indoor and outdoor. Do you want to move to the next slide? And also about adaptability and play and focusing on children walking and cycling. Do you want to move to the next one? And how the importance, I just can't overlay the fact, the importance of the design of junctions. It sounds really boring, but where you put that drop curve, where you put those materials has an impact about how people use the street. Do you want to go to the next one? but also about the interaction between play and the focus on how people and children get to those places and creating hubs locally so that it doesn't feel a mile away from where your home is. Do you want to go to the next one? Are we there? Is that the last one?
I think.
Oh, there we go. Anyway,
this was just a quick piece to say, yeah, thanks very much, Sarah, to say that this scheme is now within the Vaux site. I don't know if you recognise that as Vaux, but there is a feasibility study going on at the minute to try and introduce the 6 finalists of the competition within the site. So that's a really exciting kind of spin-off from this, if you like.
Okay, thank you very much, Will. Thank you very much for the passion and the wonderful sort of pace at which you all delivered it. And I think you take the prize for finishing on time, actually. Anyway, a few words about this particular project. I should have announced it as being one of the winners, a joint winner of the Home in 2030 competition. And we're working hard to see whether we can help deliver this particular project. So we're working with Homes England to see whether we can enable the winners to build it out. And we're talking to Sunderland about how that might happen on the Vaux site. So really exciting. I think one of the reasons it was successful was because it tried to touch on so many particular issues. It was rich in content. We rather dubbed the drawings, love the drawings, as "Where's Wally?" and had a sort of sense of wanting to engage with it and look into it and enjoy it. Maybe not everybody understands who Where's Wally is. There we go. A really great scheme. I think I just want, before we answer some of the questions or refer to some of the questions in the chat, to just sort of maybe explain a little bit as a group how you work together collaboratively on this. You know, we live in strange times where normally this sort of thing would be done in a workshop. You'd have a series of meetings. You'd be sketching on a whiteboard. Now we live in a very different situation, and I personally have not had the experience of team working across teams or across media. It would be good, I think, for graduates and those applying to actually understand how that worked in real time and in practice. Maybe kick off, Will.
I mean, it's fair to say it's different. I mean, but that goes without saying. I think, I mean, John Norden, who's I don't think on this call, he was militant in making sure everyone was kind of, sometimes twice a day, let's just have a quick half hour, get on Jamboard, whilst also having some form of communication device on as well, and we'd just be sketching, and there'd be a lot of toing and froing. What do you think about this? Have you seen that thing? It was just a real hive of communication, really. And as Andy is just showing a perfect example there, just some very simple sketches, all sorts of doodles on top of people's drawings, and kind of, have you seen this scheme? Have we checked that we don't foul up that particular thing? But it was a real, I mean, it was intense. It was really intense, and I think, as Judith mentioned, she's saying she missed the Friday 10 o'clocks. I think for a short while it was quite a relief not to have them, because it's to do these competitions properly, you've got to treat it like a real job, and that's what we did. Put the hours in.
So Judith, Sarah, how did you find that the architects listened and you engaged positively in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was we did manage to have quite creative working sessions, and the sketches definitely showed that. And I think actually, the importance of listening in that process is really important as well. So listening and taking in what everyone says, and often not just what they're trying to communicate, but the depth of what they're trying to communicate as well. Often within this job, you will be talking about something and you think you're on the same page about it, but it's not until you draw it when you realize you're actually talking about the same thing or not. So there were some difficult conversations, weren't there, Will, through the process, which we probably don't want to remember, about how we saw things slightly differently. But I think that is part of the creative process, and we were, you know, absolutely delighted to be joint winners, and all those hours and, you know, over weekends, and particularly Will's colleague Matt, and the drawings that came out of it, I think were amazing, a testament to that collaboration approach.
Amazing, yeah.
I think also, just to say very quickly, was that there's an openness. I didn't feel that anyone was constrained by their discipline. It wasn't like, because I think this is really important, is don't feel constrained in your knowledge, always test things to be able to open up discussion. So
really good. Okay, I've got a couple of specifics which came out of the chat. One is this concept of working in hours, not in days. Really interesting, and I just wonder whether Andy or Will can just sort of elaborate a bit on what the building undercover is about. I mean, at first sight, it looks like there's a factory on the site, but it's not that, is it? It's actually a canopy under which you are constructing. So could you just sort of elaborate a bit on this sort of working in hours concept and talk us through it a bit more?
I think where it came from initially was the suppliers of the enormous barns, as we called them, and their programs. That they looked at everything in meticulous detail, and they never gave themselves an excuse for something not happening. There was always an opportunity to make sure it happened properly. So they, I think another quote from quite a colourful character was that if Elton John's going on stage at 8 o'clock on a Saturday on the 24th of June, then that's when he's going on stage. You can't just sort of say, we're going to be a few days late or a few weeks late or a month late. And that mindset means you work things out in hours, as he said, so you know everything. And they also introduced the idea of when they put these things together and they get onto sites, it's all about the output. It's all about getting it done and getting it done brilliantly. And they work as shift work, they work as teams. And
yeah.
So
sorry to interrupt. Did you do any work on the costings, Andy, in terms of understanding how that worked out in financial benefit?
Yeah, we did actually. We priced out the whole build barn itself and how much it would cost to either buy one, hire one. It was cheaper to buy one, and then we did some longer, more in-depth studies with Cass Consultancy to work out when you scale this up. Obviously, if you're only building a small number of homes, then it's going to be a disproportional capex on the cost. But if you can then repeat it and keep on building more and more homes, then you very quickly get the benefits. And of course, it's a perfect circular economy. There is no waste from this product. You just keep on, even down to, we look carefully at the material used to sheathe them, and these materials now are that they have a good lifespan, and they then become biodegradable. So they're not just used once and thrown away. So yes, we factored that in, and it certainly looks like it's got mileage. But you've only got to look outside right now. You know, the weather's been inclement for months. You know, and I still walk around and I see people trying to bang. You know, we're still banging nails in timber in the pouring rain, in the freezing cold, in the dark. And that's how most homes get built in the UK these days. So,
thank you very much. I know we're bumping up against the end of the evening, but I have to sort of praise Sarah for her rather passionate sort of presentation. Really, really good. And I mean, it poses quite a lot of challenges as well as issues to consider. You know, how do you maintain? How do you look after? How do you make sure that what you put into the design is there for the longer term? And we heard, you know, another passionate person, Harriet, in the the Goldsmith Street presentation talking about landscape. It is the profession. I have to admit, it is a wonderful profession. But, there's just challenges, aren't there, in terms of how landscape needs to be nurtured and natured and looked after for the longer term.
I would also touch upon the question of perception and aesthetics as well, because if you want a very biodiverse native, I say the term native loosely here, I know there's a bit of challenges around the name, planting, you need to challenge what we feel is nice. I mean, maintenance is a really good question because it challenges in terms of long-term commitment to funds to associated to it. It's a really hot topic of question at the moment. I think there's various models, like for example the Parks Trusts models, where essentially a bit like Milton Keynes and other places as well. However, I think the biggest challenge really is that question of what we feel is acceptable by us. And I think we have to start questioning that and say what's acceptable also for nature, because we need to have these conversations now. There's a report, I can't remember its name, it's just come out recently about economics and biodiversity that's come out only I think last week. I can put the link in the chat. I really think we need to challenge that, because otherwise we're just going to be going round and round in circles.
Well, speaking to the converted, and I think keep watching out for the DEFRA guidance, because the interaction with nature is a major issue, the Environment Bill, major issue for government. I'm going to stop talking now and just want to add my personal thanks to all the contributors this evening. It's been great. And, I need to be inspired. Everybody needs to be inspired in these circumstances at the moment. So thank you very much for your contributions. And I'm going to hand back to Tab, who's going to finish off.
Thank you all, and thank you, Andy. So yeah, a range of absolutely fabulous speakers. Thank you so much. Just to come back to the competition, this is your site at Riverside, Sunderland. And this is the area for the first new homes. You can see where the site is and where the city centre is, and it is right next to the river. The site context is on our partner's website, so it will be on Moby's website, it will be on Trada's website, and also on our sponsor's website, the CTI. And we're asking for an indicative master plan with 100 homes on it, but one home in detail. And yes, we will be looking at counting the carbon, Andy. So we have a tool, one of many tools. Unfortunately, not all tools are equal, which is unfortunate, but we have gone with a particular one. And we're asking you to work as teams of a minimum of 4 or a maximum of 8. And as Sarah was saying, or Judith, argue, debate, ask questions, learn the language of the other professionals that you will be working with. And tomorrow night, we have some of the runners-up. But first of all, I want to say thank you to our sponsors, because we could not have brought this to you without it. So it's the Confederation of Timber Industries, Akoya, who will come and talk later in next week, Rothablas, who will also talk next week, Timber Decking and Cladding Association. I think Janet's in the audience tonight. Thank you, Janet. PEFC certification, who talked last Wednesday. The ASBP will be talking next week. I think Simon's in the audience tonight. Wood for Good, Sarah's in the audience tonight too. Thank you, Sarah. And BSW, who were in the audience last week. And these are our speakers tonight. And tomorrow we have Gwyn Roberts and a whole range of speakers from the runners-up from the Homes of 2030. And then on Thursday, we look at some homes that have been built. So they have CLT construction, they have I-joist construction, and they have solid timber and natural SIP panels. And on Friday, we ask all our speakers throughout the week and all our participants if they would like to come and join us in a virtual pub. And we just have a chat and chew the fat over and discuss how we can build better together. So I'd like to thank you all for attending tonight. As I said, this is week 2, Counting Carbon. And let me stop recording.